Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. In case you missed it, this week's podcast is a recently recorded webinar with PRI Senior Fellow Steve Hayward and our special guest, Dr. Leslie Lenkowski, Professor of Practice at the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. He is also a member of the Philanthropic Studies faculty of the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Dr. Lenkowski, an expert on philanthropy and public affairs, will offer his insights into American civil society's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and what increased restrictions on personal freedom mean for our democracy. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome, everybody, to another in PRI's periodic series of online webinars on various current topics. Today, we want to talk about the role of civil society in the whole COVID-19 era we live in. I think we're all shocked by some of the things that have happened, not just the unusual conditions we find ourselves in, but also the government's halting, inconsistent, stop-and-go responses that not only raise questions of their effectiveness, but also raise some very basic questions of governance and legality and propriety, and above all, how they're treating, after all, the citizens of a self-governing republic. So I'm delighted that we're joined today by, I think, one of the very best persons to think about this is Dr. Leslie Lenkowski, a longtime expert in philanthropy, in questions of civil society, currently professor of practice at the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at the University of Indiana in Bloomington. He was the CEO of the Corporation for National and Community Service under President Bush. Dr. Lenkowski, I'm going to toss it over to you.
Thanks very much, Steve, and it's a pleasure being with all of you today. Well, when I agreed to do this program, I did not foresee that the organization hosting it would be located in a city that was actually under a lockdown. That's not unexpected this year, as well as in light of the power that governments have historically asserted in controlling contagious disease. These powers have been extensive, following Cicero's ancient dictum, Salus populi suprema lex, the safety of the people is the first law. The word quarantine itself comes from two Italian words meaning 40 and days, and that was the amount of time that Venice required ships to sit at anchor if they were arriving from infected ports. John Locke, in his Fundamental Constitutions, written for the colony of Carolina in 1669, asserted that government has the power to take care of, I quote, corruption or infection of the common air or water and all things necessary to protect the public commerce and health. Indeed, state governments in the shortly after the establishment of the United States took these powers quite seriously. For example, in 1795, Virginia authorized quarantines in any place within this Commonwealth that, quote, shall become infected with a malignant distemper. Perhaps the most egregious use of this public health power was the Typhoid Mary case in 1907. Typhoid Mary Milan, was the first asymptomatic carrier of typhoid fever identified in New York City. She claimed she never even had the fever, but biological tests showed that she was carrying the bacillus. She was, as a result, interned on an island in New York, in the East River, first for 3 years, and then after a brief interval that I'll explain later, for the rest of her life. In other words, imprisoned for life because she was an asymptomatic carrier of a contagious disease. The Public Health Board of New York at the time was one of the leading boards in the country, And they recognized very quickly that what they did with Typhoid Mary probably could not be replicated with the several hundred others within New York City at the time thought to be typhoid carriers, and so they didn't try this again. The Spanish flu in 1918 led to the creation of a law requiring mask wearing in San Francisco. It even resulted in prosecutions and fines, and as you can see from the clipping I've put up there, it produced an anti-mask league. The federal role, which has been so prominent in the current crisis, is actually more constrained legally. Federal government has no police power as such, as given by the Constitution, and has generally deferred to state and local officials with regard to public health matters. There have been certain exceptions, particularly related to interstate commerce and immigration and border control. With regard to the latter, for example, between 1910 and 1940, it's estimated that some 300,000 Asian immigrants wound up spending time in quarantine at Angel Harbor in San Francisco Bay. Federal courts have been mindful that the needs of public health might conflict with protected civil liberties in the Constitution, and there have been a number of cases over the years and continue to be addressing that. Typhoid Mary, for example, successfully brought a habeas corpus case to get herself released from her quarantine in New York City. Unfortunately, she made the mistake of violating the terms of her release by resuming her profession as a cook, and was quickly apprehended at, of all places, a clinic for new mothers and their children, where she was working under an assumed name, and so she was sent back to her island for the rest of her life. But this is an example of how federal courts have sought to protect, to balance basic civil liberties with the needs of public health. There have also been any number of cases involving challenges to vaccination orders, and more recently, we've seen challenges to lockdown orders. It's important to keep in mind that the recent Supreme Court case involving whether or not religious institutions, Jewish as well as Christian in New York City, should be required to comply with lockdown orders, actually was fairly narrowly decided. Essentially, the court sent the case back to lower court authorities to determine whether or not the lockdown order was applying equally to all sorts of institutions, including gyms and liquor stores, as well as to religious ones. Obviously, the Constitution prohibits singling out religious organizations either for special favor or special burden. It does not, however, prevent their being closed too, as long as other organizations were closed as well. We're hearing a lot these days about the key case in federal jurisprudence and what's called the jurisprudence of hygiene. And that was a 1905 case called Jacobson versus Massachusetts. Jacobson was a 45-year-old Lutheran pastor who had had 2 prior experiences with being vaccinated, neither of which went too well, according to the court record. So he wanted to refuse vaccination, which was required by, of all places, the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts. His case made it to the Supreme Court, where he ultimately lost. The police power of a state, Justice John Marshall Harlan wrote in the decision, must be held to embrace at least such reasonable regulations established directly by legislative enactments as will protect the public health and public safety. But of course, so Jacobson eventually continued to refuse to be vaccinated, but wound up paying a relatively modest fine. But Harlan's opinion leaves open the question of what is reasonable. And that continues to be revisited most recently in Pennsylvania. And I'm sure we've not heard the end of this. Is there an alternative, though, between doing nothing and letting disease run its course, or imposing a variety of potentially draconian public controls aimed at preventing the spread of disease? American history offers numerous examples of how the United States has responded collectively to crises by turning to civil society. What is civil society? Well, it has many definitions, but generally, we think of civil society as being those institutions between the individual and the family on the one hand, and government on the other. These are institutions that, to one degree or another, aim at providing public benefits rather than mostly providing private ones as businesses might. The classic account of the role of what he called civic associations in American life was provided by Alexis de Tocqueville in his book, Democracy in America, written in the 1830s. In that book, he identified three important roles that civic associations, civil society, play in American life. One, they undertake tasks that government might otherwise need to do, a kind of functional role. Secondly, they teach the habits necessary for being good citizens and living in a democracy, a kind of educational role. And last, but for our purposes not least, they develop a sense of self-interest rightly understood, a moral role. They encourage Americans to moderate their desires. Even with the growth of government that occurred throughout the 20th century, the United States generally continues to rely on civil society more than virtually any other country does. And this has been especially true in the past in responding to crisis. University of Chicago professor Elizabeth Clemens recently published a historical account called Civic Gifts about how Americans have used civil society to respond to crises. Even before the American Revolution began, colonists up and down the Atlantic seaboard were sending a variety of gifts and supplies to Bostonians who were perceived to be on the cutting edge of revolution, as indeed they were. Good parts of the Civil War were actually carried out through civil society groups. A famous one was the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which was responsible for a variety of health and hospital-related efforts during the Civil War. During the 19th century, as financial downturns hit especially big cities, communities organized. The early days of the United Way, for example, can be dated back to efforts to help people who had been unemployed or faced other kinds of hardship as a result of financial downturns. World War I actually is the distinction of helping to launch the national career of Herbert Hoover, who was instrumental in organizing relief efforts to aid Belgium and other countries that were caught up in the war. But there were also a lot of other ways, including the work of the Red Cross, that played a role in mobilizing the United States during that war. Indeed, it was something of a patriotic duty, Clemens reports, to be a member of the Red Cross. That continued through the Spanish flu, where a lot of the efforts to respond to it were driven by the Red Cross and similar organization. Even the Great Depression proved, at least initially, to be a vehicle that in which Americans sought to work together voluntarily. The first tax deduction for corporate giving, for example, was proposed by the Roosevelt administration early on in the Great Depression to help provide additional resources for civil society. The basic point that Clemens makes is that by responding to crises through civil society, Americans were able to preserve their personal freedom, their freedom of personal action, while addressing tasks that required collective action. These organizations also fostered a kind of equality and reciprocity. Everyone could contribute, and as a result, everyone was indebted to each other. However, with each crisis, the public sector has taken on more influence for several reasons: the scale of disasters, changing public philosophies such as progressivism, which justified a more active and professional state. Indeed, by the end of the Second World War, the lines between public and private had blurred considerably, and they would become even more so with the advent of the Great Society and afterwards. Partly as a result, the civic associations engaged in disaster relief became more professional and less participatory, more hierarchical and less community-based. As Harvard professor Robert Putnam and many others have observed, we have also seen a more general trend toward lessened participation in all sorts of civic associations. We are more likely to write checks now than to give time. We are more likely to associate with people similar to us than with people who might be different in some way. We have become more concerned with I and less with we, as Putnam argues in his latest book, The Upswing. About 2 hours ago, thanks to the magic of Zoom, I was able to sit in on an interview at the Manhattan Institute with Utah Senator Mike Lee, who has, for the past couple of years, been directing a study by the Joint Economic Committee of what we call social capital, another way of describing civil society, the civil society, and the Joint Economic Committee reinforces and extends many of Putnam's concerns. Senator Lee indicated that the Joint Economic Committee intended to look at how the pandemic is affecting civil society. So that's what I want to turn to now. In the first half of the year, there was no shortage of stories that the pandemic and the accompanying economic downturn would damage an already weakened civil society. Among the headlines, reports project 22,000 nonprofits will fail. Giving is down 7.5%, and so on. More than half of fundraisers expect to raise less money this year than the year before. Now, there's no question, lots of employees being laid off, services to clients being curtailed. Now, there is no question, and I'm not suggesting otherwise, that there haven't been real problems. I think the major problems, we've seen unprecedented demand for some services that some kinds of civil society groups, particularly those related to healthcare, provide. There have been declining revenues, but these have chiefly come from earned income, fees for services, admissions to museums, and so on, which turn out to account for about half of all nonprofit revenues. And yes, there will probably be some closures, particularly of organizations that were operating on a financial margin. But taking a longer look from December, not from June, offers a different outlook. Giving has bounced back. If you talk to development officers at major colleges and universities, they think 2020 is going to wind up looking like a normal year in fundraising. An annual event that occurred on Tuesday called Giving Tuesday, which seeks to get people who haven't spent all their money on Friday after Thanksgiving yet to give to charities online, reported a record increase of some 25% in gifts recorded. More people, surveys show, plan to increase than decrease their gifts this year. Why is this happening? Well, major reason is that the revival of the economy is as important for civil society as it is for business. Donations typically follow the stock market, and earned income is less likely to bounce back, but it is coming. Job growth in nonprofits also tends to parallel the labor force. And yes, government has made some efforts to shore up nonprofit organizations. The PPP program, for example, extended loan guarantees to nonprofit groups. Also important, nonprofit groups have been adopting new ways of operating and delivering services. Most nonprofits have been through a severe economic contraction before. During the Great Recession from 2008 to 2010, giving declined by some 15% from pre-recession levels and then recovered fairly quickly. So many nonprofit leaders know how to operate in times of hardship. They've made a number of innovations, including use of telecommunications and computers to deal with the people they seek to help. And they've put to use underutilized resources. My slide has a picture of a school bus, which has been refitted to be a Wi-Fi hub and parked in a place where service is needed. Donors have been relaxing restrictions on grants to make them more flexible, and foundations and donor-advised funds have actually increased their spending. The money tends to chiefly go toward human services, health, and education, which is where the need is. There have been new types of fundraising, webinars being one, but perhaps of most importance for the long run is after many years in which trust in nonprofits had been declining, we are seeing signs that it is picking up, especially for pandemic-related groups like hospital, the greater public approval. Now, the pandemic has revealed certain sorts of problems. Some groups that depend heavily on public contact may be in serious trouble. Medium-sized to small-sized museums and symphonies, for example. But a number of smaller colleges were widely expected to close as a result of the difficulties in having residential students, but that does not seem to have occurred. Demand has also greatly strained nonprofits that provide support to the needy, such as food banks, and this is related to an underlying reflection of some of the problems that are well known about income distribution in American society. For all nonprofits, lack of reserves is a problem. Half of nonprofit groups have less than 6 months of money on reserve, so their ability to be flexible, to be resilient in the face of downturns has been a problem. Add to that, donors have typically been reluctant to support operating costs and endowment. There have also been some quality of service issues and a loss of volunteers. Essentially, the effect of the pandemic on civil society will depend on how long it lasts. But I want to also emphasize that civil society, in turn, also plays an important role in determining how long the pandemic will last. Nicholas Christakis of Yale University has recently published a book called Apollo's Arrow, which he ends by asking, how do pandemics come to an end? Clearly, public health measures and medical advances are critical. Growing immunity within the population as a result of exposure to the virus matters a lot too. The chart on the lower right-hand side of my slide comes from that book and shows death rates per 100,000 people from infectious disease. It's actually a CDC chart. And as you'll see, the 20th century has seen a steady decline in death rates. The insert there charts the 70s to early 90s, and what you're seeing is a little uptick as a result of HIV/AIDS. But basically, public health measures and medical advances, growing immunity within the population has made a substantial difference in reducing the effect of contagious diseases. But points out Christakis, viruses and other pathogens never really disappear, though they may weaken. What really happens is we learn how to deal with them, and we learn how to live with them. The question I want to pose is, does the diminished role of civil associations in American life make it harder to do so? A historian who's looked at the Spanish flu in 1918 has argued that there was a higher sense of civic duty and agency than we find today. That wouldn't be surprising. The Spanish flu came at the end of World War I, a period of national mobilization. Lots of associations were being formed during that period. We call it the golden age of associations. Even the phrase social capital was invented around that time to describe the network of associations and the value they bring to participants. However, today we have become increasingly reliant on experts and public health officials to shape how we behave in response to the crisis. Now, it's easy to exaggerate. News shows are full of heartwarming tributes to people helping other people, such as sewing groups making masks. Yet we also tend to look at government leadership as playing a critical role in how we deal with the pandemic. Indeed, we've just finished an election in which plans for the pandemic proved to be a major issue. As you know, state and even local officials are very much in the spotlight. Trust the experts has become something of a mantra of the pandemic, even when the experts themselves disagree. One such expert recently wrote that we shouldn't expect appeals to civic duty to work anymore, that what was necessary was to scare people into compliance. And one of the examples she gave was a spot many of you probably saw in California about someone on a ventilator having a good deal of difficulty breathing. That enforcing strict rules, not appealing to civic duty, is the way to deal with a pandemic. Now, it's certainly the case when infections are peaking and hospitals are approaching capacity, emergency measures are undoubtedly required. But when a crisis is not at the door, and especially after the most serious dangers have passed and long-term adjustments are called for, a personal willingness to take reasonable precautions is needed, or in terms Tocqueville might have recognized, to pursue our self-interest rightly understood. Civic associations are valuable not just for the services they provide, but also for the sense of right and wrong, of duty they instill. If Americans are no longer as involved with these groups as they used to be, and if civic associations themselves are playing less of a role, except perhaps as grantees, in responding to a disaster, one may wonder how effectively they can foster the sense that we are all in this together, that our individual actions are as important for ending the pandemic as the views of experts and the rules enacted by officials. Paradoxically, can social distancing and similar non-medical steps be as effective without greater social ties? There's actually, I learned a few minutes ago, some studies that are showing where social cohesion has been higher, there have been fewer deaths from the pandemic. If one really wants to shame or encourage people to take steps that would lessen the need for government mandates, could the social ties that bind be at least as powerful as lectures from public officials, such as a plea last summer from the public health officer in Monroe County, Indiana, where I live, that everybody needs to be nice to everybody. Conversely, to the extent we rely more on government actions, will we find ending the pandemic more difficult and more protracted than we would like it to be? Plus, do we risk the possibility that restrictions imposed for an emergency might linger even in an attenuated form, just like a pathogen? I don't know the answers to these questions. I just pose them for us to have a discussion. But I am not alone in thinking we might do better to give civil society a more important place in how we respond to pandemics and other disasters, especially if we are to develop more fruitful social attitudes. Perhaps some lessons can be learned from the experience some civic groups have had. When colleges and universities reopened this fall, many expected spikes in infections, and in some places they occurred. But all things considered, this semester is concluding with about as much success as one might have hoped for. According to the New York Times, in a survey of 1,700 colleges and universities, There have been a total of 321,000 infections, or roughly 200 per school. Why? Well, judging from what I have seen at Indiana University, a mixture of public health measures and the fact that universities are often relatively close-knit communities that can not only impose rules about masks, contact tracing, and the like on pain of suspension or expulsion, but they can also count on a variety of members of the institution to hold each other accountable. And what about religious congregations? Frequently, they have been viewed as super spreader events waiting to happen. Indeed, there are dangers of community spread through praying, singing, and the like. But we also know that members are usually especially dutiful, provided they get clear direction from spiritual leaders. They give more, they volunteer more. Let me just conclude this way. What do pandemics teach? First of all, they teach the limits and possibilities of medical and scientific knowledge. But in addition, we should be paying attention to the limits and possibilities of political and social institutions as well. Pandemics are not new, but there's much to be learned from them. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Les. Gosh, you've given us a lot to think about there. Your final slide took me back to thinking about, and I've been asking this question myself since the beginning, is what would Friedrich Hayek have made of all this? And your last slide really raised that in acute form, because of course his whole teaching boiled down to centralized knowledge will falter, localized knowledge is more important and should be harnessed. And a couple things, I'll make a couple of comments for you to respond to, rather put a question mark on the end like the Jeopardy rule. I'll try to anyway. Of course, when you invoke self-interest rightly understood, the famous phrase of Tocqueville, I immediately go back to the obvious implication, which is it assumes that individual citizens are capable of personal responsibility. And gosh, one of the things that has so annoyed me about this whole thing from the beginning is exactly I think maybe contempt is too strong a word from our leaders, but the lack of any confidence that citizens could be appealed to on the basis of personal responsibility. So when you think about the fact that we know and have known from the beginning that the risk of COVID was not uniform across the whole population, but was clustered especially to older people, to people with immune system problems and other vulnerabilities, it should not have been hard to have crafted a public health strategy that communicated that spectrum of risk more broadly to the population, and then said, now, knowing what you know, instead of these ridiculous rules we had about Thanksgiving, say don't have more than 3 people and all the rest, and maybe it's true that the current spike we're seeing this week is traceable to some Thanksgiving events. It seems to me it would have been a lot better. I guess part of what I'm trying to get at here, and I shouldn't ramble as long as I am, is seems to me that the arbitrary and inconsistent and heavy-handed way, and the stop-start of the shutdowns, the way we've gone about this has actually reduced public trust in our government, has increased reckless behavior in some instances, has made people more dubious of what's going on. Whereas you might have said to people, here are the risks. If you have elderly people in your family, you might not want to have them for Thanksgiving. You might want to have a separate room. And now you, as grown human beings and American citizens, decide for yourselves. I don't know if I'm naive, but that seems to me like it would have been a lot better way to go about doing this.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with that. I was looking on the website earlier today of the PTA Association. A lot of controversy over should we open schools or not. And of course, we know that school children are unlikely to transmit the infection. Well, they had a series of statements the organization has taken. And I can't say I read them all, but as I went down the titles, they were always Congress should appropriate more money for this or that. I mean, there are a whole variety of things in which the PTA was not speaking on behalf of parents or even teachers as such, but rather, and saying, open those schools, we can do it, but rather saying, here's what we need in order to proceed. I think that's part of the point. We've been so used, particularly since the Second World War, in responding to disasters by looking to resources and leadership from public officials, that the ability of groups at the local level, civil society groups, we hardly ever think about it anymore, other than to maybe sew some masks or make some desks for children who don't have them. Those are fine things, but just to start.
Yeah, now I want to ask a particular question about something you said toward the end. You mentioned you've just seen some research showing that where there are higher measures of social cohesion, there's been a lower infection rate. I am wondering, and I mean, you probably don't know the answer to this. Maybe nobody does yet, but the question to be pursued is, I wonder if that explains Florida. And why I mentioned Florida is Florida has been fairly successful in containing the virus amongst a very vulnerable population, right? What's the joke? Right. Florida is God's antechamber, right?
Right.
But of course, the other thing you know about Florida, or at least some of the famous large retirement communities like the Villages, is there's a lot of social cohesion there.
Right.
I just have this hunch that the old people in Florida are looking out for one another, are behaving practically, and I'm wondering if we're going to find that Florida's relative success is going to be traceable to the social cohesion measures.
That'd be a very interesting question. There are limits to that. For example, it's been widely reported that Orthodox Jewish communities in the New York area have been hard hit as well. You would think those are pretty cohesive communities. So we're still at the early stages. My only hope, I mean, I agree that would be an interesting question to answer. I hope as well, as somebody who lives in a university town and just dreaded the return of 30,000 undergraduates, that we spend some time trying to understand what did work in universities. I had a friend up at Purdue who assured me that by October they'd be sending everyone home. Didn't happen. I think that's the experience of a lot of colleges and universities. Why? What did they do right? What does it tell us, not only about the masking and the testing, but also the degree to which students and faculty were taking more responsibility for what was going on the campus?
I've heard, by the way, of course, one problem with anything like this is you just hear lots of facts and figures claimed. You're never quite sure what's true. Things change quickly. All those caveats aside, I've heard that as of a month ago, this is when I heard it, and maybe it's changed, that there'd only been one college student in the whole country hospitalized from COVID. Lots and lots of cases. But again, the younger cohort, much less vulnerable to its effects. And I don't know if you've heard anything like that or what you...
Well, I think the real danger that concerned people is the transmission to elderly faculty. Yes. I am retired, but like you, Steve, I'm sure you know of lots of colleagues who should have retired but are still hanging in there. Well, yeah, we'll leave that for another time.
Yes. One thing that you didn't touch on, and maybe you don't care to too much, is I wonder to what extent, made me think of it as the charts from Nick Christakis you had up on one of your slides. And of course, you don't want to make light of this, but I wonder to what extent the level of intensity about COVID is related to a broader phenomenon of our long-term progress toward a risk-free mentality, right? The standard jokes are, as you know, I mean, I was a kid, we didn't wear bike helmets, right? And, knee pads. And now we talk about how we send our kids out in bubble wrap, and there's a large truth to all of that. But more broadly, the risk-free mentality we've been creeping towards for decades. And a couple of people pointed out that even as recently as the last decade, we had some pretty severe flu seasons. The flus were not as serious as COVID, but nonetheless, we had completely full ICU hospital areas. People don't know this because it wasn't reported, but you've had a lot of hospitals had to put up tents out in the parking lots and so forth to handle flu cases. And we didn't have a mask mandates. We didn't have the crisis mentality take hold. And yet here we are 5 years later, we're doing it now. And so I don't know.
Yeah, I remember the statements. I think it was the Surgeon General in 69, something like that. Don't hold me to the exact, but there was a Surgeon General of the United States within the last 40 years or so who declared that the age of contagious diseases was over. There have been several like that, by the way. I mean, I've been reading a number of these very good histories like the Christakis book covering this. I mean, pandemics are not new in human history. And we can get overconfident. And I think we have been overconfident. The major exception we've seen is HIV/AIDS. And it's important to know we've never really developed a cure for HIV/AIDS. We've learned how to live with it. And that's partly as a result of medical advances, but partly, I think, the community at risk of HIV/AIDS decided themselves to work to take more responsibility to do the kind of things that would minimize their risk.
Yeah. So now you mentioned, toward the end, you mentioned someone who had said, well, actually, I'll just be direct about it. I think you're referring to the article in the New York Times yesterday. I've got it up on my other.
Yes.
The headline for people who don't read the Times, it's time to scare people about COVID.
Right.
By Dr. Elizabeth Rosenthal.
That is exactly it.
Yeah. And I mean, it seems to me the obvious problem with that is, the old crying wolf business, right? One of the things that I am worried about ahead is whether we turn the corner in 6 months from a vaccine or 16 months from all of the above. I am worried that what we're going to get is something like we got after 9/11 with the Department of Homeland Security. We're going to get a proposal for a cabinet-level Department of Pandemic Prevention. And that, in my opinion, would be a mistake. What do you think? And what are you?
No, I was actually in the Bush administration during 9/11. And it's worth recalling that President Bush initially resisted the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. He thought it was a very bad idea, but eventually he succumbed to pressure from Congress and the media and went forward to create it. I do think we could get that. As I said, the pathogen lives on, maybe in an attenuated form, or better put than that is the great novel by Albert Camus about a plague in northern Africa, which he says the plague bacillus will always be with us. And it will. And the question is what our responses will be.
Yeah. Now, I'm not a lawyer, although I study a lot of law and constitutional issues, and I know you're not a lawyer also, but also, like me, follow these things as sensible people do. And we have a questioner who wonders if there's any, I guess the particular form of the question is there any remedy against our government for the arbitrary shutdowns of essential versus non-essential businesses? I mean, my understanding of takings law is that in practice there really isn't, but maybe there ought to be. What do you think about?
Well, the courts have generally deferred, the federal courts have generally deferred to state and local courts, although a recent decision in Pennsylvania I referred to in passing may be an exception to that. I think the basis for overruling state or federal or local decisions will have much more to do with clearly protected rights within the Constitution. And that would be religion, freedom of the press, and so on. Takings, I think, we do allow takings with proper compensation. So the question would be then not whether the takings clause prevents closing of certain sorts of organizations, but whether as a requirement there should be compensation. In a way, we already have they're debating as we speak yet another bill in Congress to provide forms of compensation. So I think that would be the issue. It's really quite extraordinary to read the history of public health law. I didn't even know there was a field, the hygiene of jurisprudence.
Right.
The jurisprudence of hygiene, excuse me. And but it is a long one, and invariably Cicero wins.
Right. Yes. I've always been fascinated with the Jacobson case you mentioned, and you were quite important to mention that the penalty there for refusing a vaccine. By the way, as I recall, that vaccine was for smallpox.
Smallpox, yeah.
Much more serious disease than COVID, I think it's fair to say. And the penalty there was a $5 fine.
$5. Mm-hmm.
Right. Not a trivial amount in 1905, but not excessive either.
Not excessive. Mm-hmm.
Right.
And it's also the case that Jacobson, although he was a Lutheran pastor, might have thought he'd cite religious objections. He'd been vaccinated on 2 other occasions and had a bad reaction.
Right. Yeah.
So he was citing a health objection.
Right. That decision had an interesting career. I just mentioned it just for interest of listeners. That decision was cited as the main reason behind the Buck versus Bell decision by Justice Holmes, which was a very involuntary sterilization. He compared it to a vaccination with anyway. So that
public health.
Right. That case has had a peculiar career and a somewhat dubious recollection down the road. Okay. The other thing that's happening right now, I mentioned the general climate of this risk-free mentality that runs across so much public policy these days. Another one, and it's something a questioner has asked about, is I'll give it this form. We hear a lot about how there's disproportionate impact or disproportionate infection rates among different ethnic groups, poors and minorities, which may have more to do with their occupations, their service workers and so forth, or poverty and population density rather than skin color. But then you did hear the incoming Biden administration say they want to make sure that vaccines are distributed equitably. Okay, when I hear equity cited these days, I usually am afraid we're about to get the identity politics drill run. And it seems to me that 1, that seems doubtful, and 2, that further reinforces public skepticism that there are too many agendas being imposed upon a crisis like this. Well,
Christakis has a very interesting suggestion in his book, which has not achieved much publicity. He feels that with limits on the supply of vaccines initially, we should be giving it to younger people first rather than older people.
Oh,
why? I mean, younger working age people, I think, are what he has in mind. Why so? Well, I've been telling people ever since February that as a retired professor, retirement was great preparation for social distancing. I don't see a lot of people in the normal course of events anyway. On the other hand, those service workers, and many others, see lots of people. They are much better at spreading this infection than I would be. I might spread it to my wife, but that's about it. So maybe we should be giving the limited supplies of vaccine to the working age population first. Don't hold your breath on this suggestion. I really doubt if Dr. Fauci would propose it, and not just because of self-interest.
Yeah. It's one of the things. Another thing that's really disturbed me about this entire episode is the dismissal, sometimes contemptuous dismissal, sometimes the active suppression of dissenting or heterodox opinions from very well qualified people, not from cranks or some crackpot somewhere, but from I'm thinking of Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford, and Scott Atlas has been demonized, right. And YouTube taking down videos from people and so forth. That ought to disturb everybody, it seems to me, because it means we're getting we talk about herd immunity. We have now a herd mentality that may be making us path dependent in certain ways.
Well, and we've also, the mantra of the pandemic is going to be trust the experts. But what's an expert, and what should we trust them on? There was a great essay by Harold Lasky. It appeared as a Fabian paper. I just dug it out, and it's been reprinted in a magazine called Society with a little introduction. It's called The Limitations of the Expert. And basically, Lasky says an expert is somebody who knows a lot about a little. A statesman, or we would call a public figure, is someone who knows a little about a lot. And Lasky, who is nothing if not an expert himself, argued strongly that we really needed more statesmen in public life. And I think when we look back on our political institutions, we might ask whether or not we were too reliant on experts, and expertise itself is a contested issue, and not enough on people with the broad judgment to make use of expertise, but also to make use of other kinds of information.
Oh, I'm going to have to chase that Lasky essay down, because just as a little minor trivia point, it was Harold Lasky who was this lifelong pen pal of Oliver Wendell Holmes.
Right.
And it was Lasky to whom Holmes wrote his letter saying, in the Buck versus Bell case, I felt I'd come closer to the Darwinian truth of the matter than ever before. Okay. I think maybe make this the last question here. I have a hunch, not a hunch, I think this is a certainty, but how it turns out is where I have a hunch. Social scientists, public health experts, public administration experts like yourself are going to be studying this episode for years and generating a lot of, I think, revisionist histories and second thoughts about the matter. And my hunch is that we're going to, on balance, find that we made a lot of mistakes, and maybe we will learn something from that and do things better. What do you think? Do you have any hunches on how this is going to fall out going forward?
Well, no, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. There are going to be some great studies coming forward. The one thing we haven't talked about here, and I guess we ought to raise it at the end, is the performance of the president and his key, and the vice president, my Hoosier compatriot Mike Pence. And I think there are many ways it could have been better. But I think really, and certainly the claims of, the Chinese exclusion and so on probably weren't as effective as the president would like to say. But after all, you could fly from Wuhan to Vancouver and then come to the United States. But I do think that the role of presidential, and of course in California, you've had a very visible governor. In New York, the same thing. What should a public figure, who of course has the bully pulpit, be saying at this kind of time? And I think clearly from what, well, not so clearly, but from what Bob Woodward reports, President Trump did understand the seriousness of this fairly early on. And it seems to me that the administration was remiss in not really developing a better public affairs strategy than it went forward with. And of course, this too is one of the problems of relying on the experts. What you really need to understand is not what the experts tell you, but how to communicate that effectively, meaning in a way to get us to respond to those of us who aren't experts. It is a basic challenge, not only in this area, but in economic policy and all sorts of government policies.
Yeah, that's a large, my one sentence summary of the matter is that President Trump's penchant for being a chaos agent and a disruptor, which served him well in some respects, served him very poorly in this one. And that's a long subject. Lest we've run to the end of our time, I want to thank you for this excellent overview of the matter.
Thanks to our guests, Dr. Leslie Lenkowski and Steve Hayward. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcasts at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.